The bowl of minced iron fish had gone cold 3 times that day, and still the hatchling would not touch it. Meridian Outpost sat in a wide ring above the clouds of Thal 9, held up by 4 thick support towers and a lot of stubborn engineering. From up there, the storms below looked almost gentle, soft gray smears moving across the surface of the planet. But everyone who worked at the outpost knew better. Those storms had teeth. One of them had torn through the eastern nesting cliffs only a week ago, and it had cracked open a nest that should have stayed closed for another month. That was how Rill came into the world. Early, small, and frightened. His mother, Kess, had carried him through the last part of the storm herself, wings folded tight around the cracked egg to keep the rain and wind away from it. She was not young. She had lost hatchlings before, in years when the storms were worse and the shelters were fewer, and she had promised herself she would not lose another. So when Rill hatched 2 days after she reached the outpost, thin and gray and barely making a sound, she stayed beside him without sleeping, without eating, without doing anything except watching him breathe. The trouble was, Rill would not eat. The Drashin keepers tried first. They knew hatchling care better than anyone at the outpost, and they had raised dozens of young dragons over the years. They offered warm meat, cold meat, meat cut into strips, meat mashed into paste. Rill turned his head away from all of it. The human veterinary staff tried next, thinking maybe the problem was medical, maybe something in his blood or his stomach was working against him. Scans showed nothing wrong. He was simply, stubbornly, refusing to eat. Owen Marsh, who ran the outpost, was told about it during his morning reports, and he did not like what he heard. A dying hatchling on his station, with a mother like Kess standing guard over it, was the kind of problem that could turn into a much bigger problem very quickly. The alliance between humans and Drashins was still new, still fragile in places, held together by careful words and careful promises. If word got out that a Drashin hatchling had died at a human station, some of those promises might not survive it. Nobody thought to ask Dana Wells about any of this, because nobody had much reason to. Dana was one of the outpost's junior technicians, the kind of worker whose job was mostly cleaning enclosures, checking water levels, and filling out logs that few people ever read. She was quiet in a way that made people forget she was in the room. She did not have any special training in dragon behavior. She had only been assigned to the nursery wing because someone needed to mop the floors near Rill's enclosure, and she happened to be free. She was there on the 3rd night, working late because the storm had knocked out part of the cleaning schedule and things had fallen behind. The nursery wing was mostly empty at that hour, lit by a few low lights, quiet except for the soft hum of the climate systems and the occasional shifting sound of Kess moving in the shadows near her son's enclosure. Dana did not look at either of them much. She worked the way she always did, without much noise, humming quietly to herself the way she sometimes did when a task was boring and the room was too silent. It was an old, simple tune, nothing special, the kind of thing a person might hum without even noticing they were doing it. She noticed the sound behind her before she understood what it meant. A small scraping noise, claws against metal flooring, careful and slow. When she turned, she found Rill standing at the edge of his enclosure, closer to the barrier than he had come in 3 days, his head tilted toward her. Dana froze, unsure if she was allowed to be this close, unsure if she had done something wrong. But Rill did not pull away. He made a small sound, somewhere between a whine and a question, and pressed his nose against the barrier. Carefully, she picked up the bowl of food that had been sitting untouched nearby, and without really thinking about why, she kept humming as she opened the small feeding gate at the bottom of the barrier. She half expected Kess to come charging out of the shadows and stop her. Instead, the great dragon simply watched, still as stone, eyes fixed on her son. Rill ate. He ate slowly at first, then faster, until the bowl that had gone cold 3 times that day was finally completely empty. Dana stayed exactly where she was the whole time, humming the same simple tune, too afraid to move in case it broke whatever strange thing had just happened. When the nursery supervisor found the empty bowl the next morning, she assumed someone had made a mistake in the log. It was only when she checked the security recording, expecting to find nothing unusual, that she saw a young technician sitting on the floor of the nursery wing, humming to a hatchling that had refused every meal for 3 straight days. Word reached Owen Marsh before lunch. He did not believe it until he watched the recording himself, twice. By the end of that day, Dana Wells, cleaner of enclosures and filler of logs, had been pulled into a meeting she never expected to attend, sitting across from a director who did not know what to make of her, and a mother dragon who was watching her through the window with an expression that was very hard to read. Rumors moved through Meridian Outpost faster than any official message could, and by the next morning, everyone on the station seemed to know some version of what had happened in the nursery wing. Some said the hatchling had been cured by human medicine. Others said the human technician had some secret gift with animals. Neither version was true, but neither Owen Marsh nor anyone else had a better explanation to offer instead. Kes did not care about the rumors. She cared about only one thing, and that was her son. She had watched, from the shadows of the enclosure, as a stranger fed him when nobody else could. Gratitude was not the first feeling that rose in her. Suspicion was. Drashans did not trust easily, and Kes trusted less than most. She had lived through the early years of the conflict between her people and the humans, before the alliance was signed, before anyone dared call it peace. She remembered human weapons more clearly than human kindness. So when her son responded to a human stranger in a way he had not responded to his own kind, her first thought was not wonder. It was fear. What if this was some kind of trick? What if the humans had done something to him, something she could not see, to make him trust the wrong person? She said as much, through the translator device fixed near her enclosure, in a voice low and rough with worry. Owen Marsh, standing at a careful distance, tried to explain that nobody had done anything to Rill, that the technician in question had simply been in the right place at the right time. Kes was not convinced by explanations. She wanted to watch. So it was decided, after a long and tense meeting that Dana barely understood the politics of, that she would be temporarily assigned to help with Rill's care under close supervision. Iris Cade, the outpost xenobiologist, would oversee the sessions and record everything that happened. Kes would be present at every single one, watching from just beyond the barrier, never leaving her son alone with the human for even a moment. Dana found the arrangement strange and a little frightening. She had never worked directly with a Drashan before, let alone one as large and clearly protective as Kes. But she also could not ignore the fact that Rill, weak as he still was, brightened slightly whenever she entered the room. So she showed up each day, sat quietly near the enclosure, and did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to be calm and patient and honest about her intentions. Kes tested her in small ways at first, the way any careful mother might. She would growl low in her throat when Dana got too close, watching to see if the human would flinch or back away too quickly, or if she would freeze in a way that suggested fear covering something worse. Dana did flinch, the first few times, because the sound was enormous and her body reacted before her mind could tell it not to. But she never ran. She never raised her voice. She simply waited for the growling to stop, and then continued doing what she had been doing, whether that was sitting quietly or offering food through the small gate. One afternoon, Rill reached his head far enough forward that his claws scraped lightly against Dana's arm. Not an attack, just a careless movement from a young and clumsy hatchling still learning the size of his own body. It left a thin scratch, nothing serious, but Kes went rigid immediately, watching closely to see what the human would do. Dana looked at the scratch, then looked at Rill, and laughed softly, more surprised than hurt. She said something gentle to the hatchling, the kind of thing anyone might say to a child who had bumped into them by accident, and went right back to what she had been doing. She did not complain. She did not pull away from the enclosure. She did not even mention the scratch to anyone afterward. Iris noticed. She wrote it down in her notes, along with a dozen other small details that seemed unimportant on their own, but were beginning to form a pattern. Rill's appetite improved every day that Dana was present. His stress readings, tracked through a small monitor attached near his enclosure, dropped noticeably whenever she sat nearby, and climbed again whenever she left. Word of these findings reached the wider Drashan community faster than anyone expected, carried by messages between the outpost and the nearest settlement. Some elders were curious. Others were angry that a human had been allowed so close to a vulnerable hatchling at all, regardless of what the readings showed. Kes found herself caught between two worlds, listening to her own people question her judgment on one side, and watching her son grow calmer and stronger in the presence of a human stranger on the other. She did not have an answer for either side yet. But for the first time since the storm, she began, very carefully, to watch Dana Wells not as a threat to be guarded against, but as a mystery to be solved. Rill's heartbeat monitor was the only steady rhythm in the room that could be trusted, and even that seemed to slow down whenever Dana Wells walked through the door. Iris Cade had been watching that monitor for almost 2 weeks now, along with half a dozen other instruments strapped carefully around Rill's enclosure. She was not the kind of scientist who liked guessing. She liked numbers, patterns, things that could be measured and checked twice. What she was seeing in Rill's data did not fit anything she had studied before, and that bothered her more than it excited her. Drashan hatchlings, according to every record she could find, bonded strongly with their birth mother and sometimes with other adult Drashans nearby during the first weeks of life. There was no record of a hatchling bonding this strongly, this quickly, with a human. And yet the readings were clear. Rill's stress hormones dropped whenever Dana entered the room. His appetite, still fragile, improved noticeably in her presence and worsened when she was gone for more than a few hours. It was not affection in any way Iris could yet explain. It looked, if anything, like relief. Meanwhile, outside the quiet walls of the nursery wing, the situation had grown louder. Word of a human bonded to a Drashan hatchling had reached the nearest settlement, and not everyone there was pleased. A group of elders sent a formal message to the outpost, questioning why a vulnerable young Drashan, born early and still recovering, had been placed in daily contact with a human worker with no training in hatchling care. Some called it reckless. A few called it disrespectful, as though it suggested Kes herself could not properly care for her own son. Kes felt the weight of those messages more than anyone realized. She had spent her whole life proving herself capable, first as a young dragon surviving the years before the Alliance, then as a mother who refused to lose another child to the storms. Being questioned now, by her own people, over a choice she had barely made herself, stung in a way she did not show on the surface. She brought her frustration to Owen Marsh directly, demanding to know exactly what the humans thought they were doing, and why her son's recovery had become something for outsiders to argue about. Owen, caught between diplomatic caution and simple human sympathy, tried to explain that nobody at the outpost had planned any of this. It had happened on its own, almost by accident, and now everyone was simply trying to understand it well enough to keep Rill alive and healthy. It was Iris who finally brought the data into the room, laid out plainly on a screen for Kes to see. Charts showing Rill's heart rate, charts showing his appetite, charts showing the sharp, consistent difference between the hours Dana was present and the hours she was not. Iris explained it as carefully and honestly as she could, admitting that she did not yet know why it was happening, only that it clearly was. Kes studied the charts for a long time without speaking. She had expected, perhaps hoped, that the numbers would show something simple, some trick or mistake that could be corrected. Instead, they showed something stranger and harder to accept. Her son's body trusted this human in a way that could not be faked or forced, in a way that even Kes herself had not managed to fully earn back since the storm. For a mother who had spent every waking moment guarding her child from danger, this was not comforting. It was frightening in a different way. If Rill's survival truly depended on a bond she did not understand and could not control, then keeping him safe meant something more complicated than staying close and staying alert. It meant trusting a stranger, a human, with the thing she valued most in the world. She asked Iris, in a voice quieter than her usual growl, whether the readings could be wrong, whether there was some other explanation that did not involve trusting a human this much. Iris admitted honestly that she did not know yet, but that she intended to find out, if Kes would allow her to keep looking. Kes agreed, mostly because she did not see another choice. That night, she watched Dana leave the nursery wing as she always did, and for the first time, she did not growl as the human passed. She simply watched, turning the mystery over in her mind the way she once turned over the memory of storms, trying to find the shape of the danger inside it, and finding, uncomfortably, that she could not. Numbers do not usually change a mother's mind, but that is exactly what happened on a quiet afternoon in the outpost's records room. Iris Cade had spent days chasing the mystery of Rill's bond with Dana Wells, testing every explanation she could think of. She checked Dana's medical records for anything unusual. She checked the food Dana handled, wondering if some scent or chemical was involved. She checked the frequency of Dana's voice, comparing it against known Drashan hatchling calls. None of it led anywhere useful, until she thought to check something much simpler. The storm records from the night Rill's egg had cracked open early. The outpost kept detailed logs of every evacuation during a storm, including exactly which staff member had carried which item to safety. It was a boring kind of record-keeping, the sort nobody ever expected to matter later. But there, buried in a list of names and timestamps, Iris found something that made her sit very still for a long moment. On the night of the storm, before Rill had even hatched, a junior technician named Dana Wells had been assigned to help move a dozen fragile Drashan eggs from a damaged shelter to a safer one. The storm had been worse than expected, the path between shelters longer than planned, and the transport carts had failed halfway through. According to the log, Dana had ended up carrying one egg by hand for nearly 2 hours, held close against her chest to protect it from the wind and rain, while she waited for a replacement cart to arrive. That egg had been Rill's. Iris brought the record straight to Kess, along with everything she now understood about Drashan eggs in their final days before hatching. It was well known among Drashan keepers, though rarely thought about in detail, that hatchlings in the egg could sense warmth, movement, and sound from whatever was closest to them in those last critical hours. Under normal conditions, that closeness belonged to the mother, and the hatchling would emerge already familiar with her heartbeat and her voice. But Rill's last hours in the egg had not been normal. During the 2 hours it took to reach safety, it had not been Kess holding him close. It had been Dana, walking through wind and rain, frightened herself, quietly talking to the egg the entire time simply to keep her own nerves steady. She had not known, and could not have known, that the small voice she used to calm herself was reaching the creature inside the shell, shaping his very first understanding of safety before he had even opened his eyes. When Rill finally hatched, 2 days later, weak and frightened in an unfamiliar place, he was searching, without knowing it, for the exact combination of steady heartbeat and low, familiar voice that had carried him through the worst night of his short life. Kess, standing beside him the whole time, offered him warmth and protection, but not that particular sound, not that particular rhythm. Dana, arriving days later to clean an enclosure, had simply, unknowingly, hummed the very thing he had been waiting for. Kess listened to all of this without moving, her large eyes fixed on the storm log as though the words on the screen might change if she looked at them long enough. When Iris finished explaining, the silence in the room stretched out for a long time. Finally, Kess spoke, her voice low and rough in a way that had nothing to do with anger. She admitted that she had spent every day since the storm believing that her son's strange attachment to a stranger was something wrong, something she needed to fix or control. She had never once considered that it might be something owed, that somewhere in the chaos of that terrible night, while she herself had been fighting through the storm from a different direction, another set of arms had been the ones keeping her son safe. She did not apologize out loud, because that was not entirely in her nature, but something in the way she looked toward the nursery wing afterward was different. When Dana arrived for her usual visit that evening, expecting the same cautious distance Kess always kept, she found the great dragon watching her with an expression she had never seen before, somewhere between grief and gratitude, too complicated to easily put into words. Rill, sensing the shift in the room the way young creatures often do, chirped happily and pressed himself against the barrier, looking between his mother and the quiet human who had, without ever meaning to, become part of the reason he was alive at all. The order came through at the worst possible hour, though there is rarely a good hour for orders like that. A dispute had broken out at a different outpost several systems away, a disagreement between human and Drashan officials that had turned briefly tense before anyone could calm it down. Nobody at Meridian Outpost had been involved, and nobody there even knew the people at the center of it. But Alliance Protocol did not care about distance. Whenever tensions rose sharply in one place, every joint station in the network was required to reduce non-essential contact between species until the situation was reviewed and cleared. Owen Marsh received the notice just after midnight, and he understood immediately what it meant for Rill. He spent almost an hour trying to argue the case for an exception, explaining to his superiors that this was not politics, that this was a fragile hatchling whose recovery depended on one specific person. The answer that came back was firm and unsympathetic. Rules were rules, especially during a review period, and no single case, however sympathetic, was allowed to become the exception that other stations might later demand for themselves. Dana was informed the next morning that her access to the nursery wing was suspended until further notice. She did not argue, because arguing was not really something she knew how to do, but she felt sick as she said it out loud to herself, imagining Rill waking up and finding her gone with no explanation he could understand. It did not take long for the damage to show. By the end of the first day, Rill had stopped eating again, exactly as he had before the Storm Night mystery was solved. By the second day, his stress readings had climbed back to the dangerous levels Iris remembered from those first difficult weeks. Kes, who had finally allowed herself to trust the arrangement, watched her son grow weaker again and felt something close to panic rise in her chest. She went to Owen Marsh herself this time, without waiting to be summoned, moving through the outpost corridors in a way that made several staff members step quickly out of her path. She did not shout, though everyone half expected her to. Instead, she spoke slowly and clearly, telling him that she understood the rules, understood the politics, understood why caution mattered after what had happened elsewhere. But she also told him, plainly, that rules written for strangers far away were now going to hurt her son, and that she would not stand quietly while that happened. Owen tried again to push the request upward, and again the answer came back the same. It was Iris, in the end, who found a way through, not by breaking the rule, but by reading it more closely than anyone else had bothered to. The order suspended non-essential contact. Iris argued, with the same careful precision she used for everything, that Dana's presence was not non-essential at all. It was, according to weeks of recorded data, directly tied to a hatchling's survival. That was not politics. That was medicine. It took most of a tense day for the argument to work its way up through enough approvals, but by evening, the order was reversed for Rill's case specifically. Dana was allowed back into the nursery wing. She found Kes waiting for her at the entrance when she arrived, something the dragon had never done before. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Kes spoke, her voice lower and softer than Dana had ever heard it, telling her plainly that she had been wrong to see her, in the beginning, as a danger to guard against. Dana had not stolen her son's trust, Kes said. She had simply been the one holding him steady on the worst night of his life, long before either of them understood what that meant. Dana did not know how to respond to something so heavy, so she did the only thing that felt right. She stepped past the dragon, into the room where Rill lay curled and still, and began to hum, quiet and familiar, the same simple tune she had always used. It took only a few minutes before Rill's head lifted, a few minutes more before he made his way, slowly and weakly, toward the sound of her voice. By the time he finally ate again, Kes was standing close beside them both, no longer watching from the shadows, but simply there, present, part of the same small circle of warmth that had somehow formed around her son without her ever fully planning it. Some mornings arrive quietly, without any sign of how important they will turn out to be. The morning Rill finally cleared his last health check was one of those. There was no announcement, no gathering of officials, no special ceremony planned in advance. Iris simply walked into the nursery wing with her usual tablet, ran the same test she had run dozens of times before, and found, for the first time, that every single number fell exactly where it should for a healthy young Drashin his age. She read the results twice before she let herself believe them, then sat back and allowed herself a small, tired smile. Word spread through the outpost slowly at first, then all at once, the way good news often does after weeks of bad news. Owen Marsh heard it during his morning reports and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying since the night of the storm. He had spent so many days worrying about how this story might end for the Alliance, whether it would become a symbol of failure or, worse, a source of new conflict, that he had almost forgotten it might simply end well. Kes heard the news before anyone thought to tell her directly, because she had been standing beside her son the entire morning, watching Iris work with the same careful attention she gave everything involving Rill. When the final result came through, she let out a long breath that seemed to release weeks of tension all at once. Rill, sensing the change in her mood the way young creatures often do, chirped happily and pressed against her side. That afternoon, Kes asked to speak with Dana privately, away from officials and reports and careful diplomatic language. Dana arrived nervous, unsure what to expect, still not entirely used to being spoken to directly by a creature as large and serious as Kess. But the dragon's tone, when she finally spoke, held none of the wariness it once had. She told Dana, plainly and without ceremony, that among her people there was an old tradition, rarely used and rarely needed, for recognizing someone outside the family who had protected a hatchling through genuine danger. It was not a title given lightly, and it had never, as far as Kess knew, been given to a human before. She said she wished to give it to Dana now, not because politics required it, and not because anyone was watching, but because it was true. Dana had held Rill safe through the worst night of his life without knowing it, and had continued holding him safe every day since, long after most people would have walked away from something that difficult and strange. Dana, who had never expected recognition for any of it, found herself without the right words to answer properly. She said only that she had never meant to become part of Rill's story, that she had simply done what felt right at the time, first with an egg in a storm, and later with a hatchling who would not eat. The formal naming happened a few days later, small and quiet, attended only by those who had lived through the weeks of worry themselves. Owen Marsh stood at the back, watching with the particular relief of someone who understood that this small, private moment had quietly done more for human Drashan trust than any official meeting ever could. Word of it traveled slowly outward from the outpost, reaching other stations and settlements over the following weeks, softened of its original controversy and reshaped instead into a story people wanted to repeat, about a human who had carried a stranger's egg through a storm and never even realized what she had done. Rill grew steadily in the months that followed, stronger and steadier with each passing week, his silver scales darkening slightly as he aged the way young Drashans did. He kept, even as he grew larger and louder and more confident, the same habit he had shown from his very first days in the nursery wing. Whenever he was tired or frightened or simply wanted comfort, he sought out the same low, familiar humming that had once brought him back from the edge of starvation. Dana never became anything grand at the outpost. She still filled out her logs, still checked water levels, still did the quiet, unnoticed work that had first brought her into that nursery wing on an ordinary night during a busy week. But every evening, before her shift ended, she made time to sit beside Rill for a while, humming the same simple tune, watching him rest easy in a way that no longer needed explaining. Kess, standing close by on most of those evenings, no longer watched the human with suspicion. She watched her instead the way she watched anyone she trusted completely, which was to say, she barely watched her at all, because there was nothing left to guard against.